So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our online webinar, Let's Be Practical About Ethics, the Accessibility and Impact of Ethics. My name is Sarah Hafferden, and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at UKZN Extended Learning, also known as UEL. So in case you are unfamiliar with UEL, we are the continuing education unit of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we offer all the short courses on behalf of the university. So we first introduced our webinars as we were in full support and compliance with the directive of a national lockdown issued to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've embraced the changes and have launched a number of projects aimed at providing free access to learning materials. So one of the projects is our online learning webinars, and from October we'll be offering webinars once a month. So please take a look at the final image at the end of this webinar for further details on our next webinar, or you can visit our website at www.ukznextendedlearning.com. So please note that due to the nature of this webinar, we will not be able to address raised hands and questions throughout the presentation. So please would you post all comments and questions in the Q&A box, and these will be addressed at the end of the webinar. We will also allow for live questions at the end. So if you would like to ask a question live, you can just raise your hand and we will open up your mic and you can ask your question live. So I'd now like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today, Professor Paulus Zulu. So Professor Zulu is a social scientist by training and holds a PhD in applied social sciences from UKZN. His core research beliefs are in moral philosophy, political economy, identity creation, health, and education. Professor Zulu has published extensively in national and international academic publications. One of Professor Zulu's current research focus areas in moral philosophy led to a book entitled A Nation in Crisis, A Search for Morality, and this was published in 2013. This was followed by research into the nation-state project in Africa, entailing exploring issues of identity, nationalism, and social cohesion. Professor Zulu is presently working on African proverbs as building blocks in African worldviews, and finally, philosophy as a formative basis of ethics and morals. Currently, Prof. Zulu is a council member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences in the Vatican City, Rome. And this body facilitates developments in the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So Professor Zulu is currently a Professor Emeritus and Morris Webb Fellow at UKZN. So welcome, Prof. Zulu, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Our topic for today is on ethics and morals. It is the first in a series of lectures on ethics and morals. And in today's lecture, I shall touch on the broad basis and origins and rationale for ethics and morals. And I will refer particularly to three cultural or major cultural regions in the world. This is Africa, America and Europe, commonly referred to as the West, and the East. And this is in no order of precedence, it's just alphabetical. Africa, America and Europe, then the East. Asia. Now, ethics and morals refer to society's beliefs on good and bad, right and wrong, appropriate and inappropriate, particularly with regard to human action. The distinction between ethics and morals lies more in the intellectual than in the practical domain. In this instance, ethics generally refers to reflections on the study of morality, whereas morality itself refers to a set of social rules, principles, norms that guide or are intended to guide the conduct of people in a society, and as beliefs about right and wrong conduct, as well as good or bad character. It would be safe to claim that there is a universality in the ethical system, notwithstanding the cultural element in the framing. In other words, every system or world system has ethics and morals. However, the way these are framed is in line with the cultural or environmental attributes obtaining in a particular place. The framing is ontological. Ontology referring to the nature of being, how people think the world came about to be what it is. In other words, just to explain the word ontology, if one has a Christian or a Judeo-Christian ontology of being, one would be believing that God created Adam and Eve and put them into paradise, and they are the fathers and mothers of mankind. That's the Christian ontology. Whereas evolutionary ontology will follow a Darwinistic line. Now, just want to dwell on the word ontology because I'm going to be using it on a number of times. So the framing of ethics is ontological and varies across cultures depending on each society's conception of nature of being, and consequently of the world. Now, writing over a century ago in a cross-cultural comparison of Oriental systems of ethics with Western systems, Chester Holcomb emphasized the universal nature of ethics. He states, and I quote him here, "It hardly need be asserted that the fundamental principles of ethics are common to all systems on Eastern or Western. Man has been one in all parts of the world and all periods," and I unquote. He proceeds to list what humans share across regions and cultures. Now, what do we share? Substantially common instincts and characteristics. We share the same desires and passions, and we share different, and our differences are not at the root, but in the development of these issues, not in kind, but in degree. Now, in other words, there is some universal sharing of attributes by humankind. From this, Holcomb concludes that it must follow that the laws which guide man's growth, which teach him how rightly to deal with himself and with a like self in others, that is to say, with his fellow man, must be essentially the same everywhere at all times. Holcomb's thesis is that humanity shares common sentiments, purposes, responses, hopes, and aspirations. Empirically, it is not difficult to attest to Holcomb's thesis. We can observe, as Holcomb did over a century ago, that despite the diversity in human nature and the fact that human experience is most directly felt within some specific social or cultural context, there is a universality about ethics and morals. For instance, universally, human wishes do not well. Universally, humanity wishes to do well, irrespective of what the object or measure of wellness is. We all mourn the loss of loved ones, appreciate the generosity of spirit, and deplore selfishness, lies, greed, and avarice, even though the objects or measures and interpretations of these might vary among cultures. The usage of the masculine form as representing humanity was common in Chester's time. Now, with growing consciousness in equality or in the equal value of the sexes, we could safely substitute men and women for wherever Holcomb says man. This presentation traces the foundation of ethics and morality across the three major dominant cultural regions of the world: Africa, America, and Europe, referred to as jointly as the West, and Asia. The order is purely alphabetical and confers no precedence of one over others. Theoretical position taken in the presentation is that despite a common humanity and therefore aspirations among the inhabitants of the world, environmental or contextual nuances give accent to specific constructions of the world. and therefore specific visions of human relationships, together with the relationships between individuals, communities, and social institutions of value to each cultural society. Now let's come to the foundations of ethics or morals. And I'm using the term ethics and morals interchangeably in this presentation. Ethics and morals have ontological foundations, the nature of the world and of society, which in turn gives rise to specific visions of the relationships among members of the social units. These are individuals, groupings, and institutions. How do we relate, or how should we relate to one another? This is literally what ethics is about. It is the desired forms of the relationships, the world that societies wish to inhabit among these units that shapes the ethics and the desired morality. An exploration of these constructs and dynamics will show how Africans, Americans, and Europeans, this is the West, and Asian societies have constructed their ethical systems. Let's come to Africa. What is the foundation of African ethics? The African moral system has its foundations in a consequentialist conception of human deeds and actions. Now, what do we mean by a consequentialist conception? Actions become good or bad, desirable or undesirable, to the extent that they promote or hinder human wellness, interest, or well-being. Now, they are bad because they have specific consequences. They are good because they have specific consequences. This is what a consequentialist conception of deeds means, or of ethics. The foundations of African ethics are therefore humanistic, with the human agency as central, and do not necessarily derive from some revealed injunction from a remote yet influential deity. This is in spite of the attributed but also realistic religious nature of Africans. In other words, African ethics does not emanate from a religion, although Africans are by nature very religious people. On the contrary, the converse is also not necessarily true. What is the converse? African ethics do not emanate from atheism. That's what I mean. This renders African ethics autonomous from religion, as eminent Ghanaian sociologist K.A. Busia states. And what does Busia say? The gods are treated with respect if they deliver the goods, and with contempt if they fail. Attitude to the gods depends on their success and vary from healthy respect to sneering contempt. In other words, gods that do not deliver are contemptuously viewed. We can thus conclude that African morality is basically humanistic and utilitarian or consequentialist. However, there is no denying that theistic religion of African people plays a role in their moral lives, although it is not the original point of reference in the African moral system. The point of departure in the African moral system is the consequence of human action. And it's just a bit in my sorry. The point of departure in the African moral system is the consequence of human deeds, and not an abstract conception of, such as human rights, justice, equality, or for that matter, democracy. In other words, African ethics is not derived by conceptions of justice, of equality, or democracy. It is driven by what are the consequences of the deeds that we perform. And should these consequences be against human wellness, then the deeds are bad. That's how the ethics goes. And should the consequences be towards the promotion of human well-being, then these are good deeds. What is relevant is the good or harm that human deeds can bring about to others. The system is therefore relational rather than directed at interpersonal or intergroup relations, or rather directed at interpersonal or intergroup relations, and not at some abstraction. That might partially explain African relationships with the state, which, although endowed with a legal persona, is in reality an abstraction. In other words, the state is a legal persona at law, but it is an abstraction. So the relationship, the ethical relationship of Africans to the state is very different from the ethical relationship of other people. That will be for the next lecture when we deal with African ethics or ethics in government. However, this observation belongs to a different discussion, as I say. 3 cardinal principles of values constitute the basis of African ethics and morality. What are these values? The concept of the common good. What is good for humanity? A social and not an individualistic conception of well-being. We view one another as a society, just not as individuals. And the conception of duties against rights. Africans have a concept of duties and not rights. Human welfare sits on the pinnacle of the hierarchy of African values, the hub of the axiological wheel. Quote. From an African perspective, human needs and interests constitute the fundamentals of life. The 3 fundamental principles are interlinked such that almost all human behavior revolves around them. Hence, upholding and promoting any of them constitutes good morals, while violation of any is both unethical and immoral. While most African teachings on ethics and morality exist in oral literature, written texts such as the teachings of Ptah-hotep, an ancient Egyptian philosopher, have existed as early as the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BC. The heart of Ptah-hotep's manuscript consists of 37 principles, for lack of a better word, that define and, more importantly, justify certain forms of behavior as being moral. And this book is called the Mart. Among the values that promote ethical behavior are, this is according to the Egyptian Ptah-hotep, integrity marked by impartiality, pursuit of truth, absence of gossip. Second value, self-control, exemplified in lack of threats, avoidance of hasty speech, masking one's inner feelings, and good listening skills. Third value, respect, shown in respect for proper speech, respect for elders and leaders, respect for ritual remembrance, submission to authority, and absence of arrogance. The next one, patience, demonstrated in good listening skills. Next, good behavior, then generosity, and finally the attainment of justice. Now, these are the core values that literally inform African ethics. Ptah-hotep even provides exemplary maxims to bring home his message. Maxims are sayings. If you are mighty and powerful, then gain respect through knowledge and through your gentleness of speech. That's one maxim. Another one, when you answer one who is fuming, turn your face and control yourself, to name a few examples. What is noteworthy and intriguing is that the same values appear in Yoruba moral epistemology in the works of Barry Harlan. The Yorubas are West Africans who inhabit the country of Nigeria. A study of African proverbs in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa demonstrates the same substantive similarities, pointing to a shared moral and ethical history. Now, this is as far as Africa goes. Let's come to Europe, and which is America and the West. Europe and America, sorry, which is referred to as the West. Western ethics and morals fall into two theoretical parts or streams. Stream one, the deontological. Stream two, the teleological and consequentialist theories. Because of this distinction, there is a difference between being right and being good in European ethics or in Western ethics. Being right and being good do not necessarily mean the same. Being right concerns itself with the right things to do, while being good relates to the consequence or impact of any of the actions taken. This might be because of the source of origin. Historically, Western ethics and morality have evolved from three different sources, not necessarily in sequential succession. The triad, this is these three, comprises A, Judeo-Christian revelation, which has a Middle Eastern source. B, human reason, which has a Greco-Roman conception. And C, human experience itself. The building blocks are therefore both religious and secular. While the divine commands or an injunction to enjoin individuals is to uphold certain virtues, the rational in human the divine commands or the divine injunction enjoins individuals to uphold certain values. The rational in humans justifies the behavior or practice based on what the paradigm considers a pure logic. Experience demonstrates the hazards of contrary behavior, commission or omission. Western ethics is primarily individualistic, holding that the primary concern of morality is individual rather than society as a whole, despite individuals working within the accepted values of large group dynamic. Both versions or streams, that is the deontological and the consequentialist, appeal to the individual in their capacity as individuals and not as members of a group. However, the consequentialist version takes into account the theoretical appeals or the theocentric appeal, theocentric centered around a God, by claiming that the best, perhaps only grounding for human dignity and universal human rights is that God creates all persons in the same image, or God loves all persons. Philosophers refer to this version of ethics as the divine theory of ethics. Now, just to digress a bit, I was quite taken aback at one of the conferences in the Pontifical Academy when Margaret Archer, the sociologist, read a paper claiming that there is no sociological justification for equality from natural law. Now, what is natural law? In natural law, we walk forward. Some people are tall, some people are short. Some people are intelligent, some people are unintelligent, etc., etc. Now, that's what natural law is. And if you go from that, then there is no basis for equality in natural law. However, the basis for equality is religious and philosophical. Now, this is literally what I'm trying to say regarding the issue of ethics. They are worked from a philosophy, not necessarily from natural law. I have this icon that's hiding my reading here, sorry. Right, the individualistic aspect derives from the accent on the individual, the human agent, as responsible for his or her own fate. Hence the accent on the individual rights and obligations. There are, however, problems with the theocentric formulation, or as critics maintain that it locates the quality of the object, that is ethics, in the creator and not in the essence. Now, let's just explain this. If ethics are God-driven, this is what the argument is, then the object of the ethics or the ethics themselves probably do not matter. It is God who matters. Now, Langerek, sorry, I've just gone out of the text here very badly from the screen moving. Excuse me just a minute. What reading from it? Right, sorry for that. Now, Langerek, then questioning the theocentric origins of ethics, says, does God approve of something because it is good? Or something is good because God approves of it? Modern philosophers get around this dilemma by linking morality to God's character, loving, because God is loving in the first instance. Therefore, morality is God's driven. The ontology concerns itself with doing the right thing. You know, I have an icon here, sorry, again, which keeps on coming into the screen. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Sorry. Just excuse me, I have a technological problem or a technological challenge, as you would put it. Some icons keep on coming into the screen as I go through it. Thank you. Pardon that. Let's go back then. The ontology concerns itself with doing the right thing, irrespective of whether the consequences of such action are good or bad. The emphasis is on logical appropriateness. Immanuel Kant, the father of deontology, provides an example where a man runs into a house seeking refuge because a determined would-be murderer chases after him. The owner of the house has a choice. One, to hide the refugee in the cupboard and lie to the would-be murderer, denying the presence of the refugee in the cupboard. Or choice two, admit that the refugee is there, thus giving the chaser a chance to kill the refugee. Admitting implies the death of the refugee, while denying implies telling the truth and risking the refugee's death. Kant's deontology advises that in this instance, telling the truth is the right thing to do. Whether the chaser comes and kills the man, it's immaterial. What's material is that you have told the truth. A consequentialist approach would advise that telling a lie and saving the refugee's life is a better option. This is probably one of the dilemmas in Western moral philosophy, a predicament which other moral paradigms do not have to face. Now let's come to Asia. The two dominant sources of Asian ethics are Buddhism and Confucianism. The former, a religious philosophy of life, and the latter, a philosophy and an organized official doctrine. Let's treat Buddhism first. In Buddhism, suffering is pivotal, the pivotal concept, and ethical or moral precepts constitute a gateway away from this ordeal. Now, in other words, humanity was born to suffer, according to Buddhism. To escape this suffering, one has to adopt a moral stance. The ultimate goal of Buddhism is therefore to escape from suffering through enlightenment reached through morality, meditation, and wisdom. Therefore, ethics and morality serve a practical teleological purpose. In other words, a practical consequentialist purpose. And to this end, the theoretical structure of ethics comprises virtues, vices, and a variety of moral rules and guidelines. Buddhism has 6 perfections that constitute good ethics or morality. What are these perfections? Generosity, moral discipline, patience and endurance, perseverance, meditative stability, and wisdom. Now, these are the virtues, ethical virtues. Contrary to these are 10 bad causes of action whose pursuit or commitment leads to unethical or behavior or immorality. The first 3 of these vices relate to actions of the body: taking life, sexual misconduct, and stealing. 4 of the vices relate to forms of speech: lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle chit-chat. While the last 3 relate to mental states: covetousness, malice, and wrong view. The similarity in substance with the 10 Commandments and with Tahotep's Mart is striking. The second branch of ethics in Asia is Confucianism. Confucianism originates from the moral teachings of ancient Chinese philosophers, Laozi and Confucius. The central tenets in the teachings are reason and virtue, as propounded by Laozi, with the Tao or reason representing, quote, the infinite power of and wisdom of God, the nature of his infinitely perfect character in action, unquote. The pursuit of the Tao, which is reason, is therefore the divine, and from this grows virtue. The teachings of Laozi were always in aphorisms, aphorisms being tez sayings or maxims such as, the upright keeps obligations of his own contract, but extracts not that of the other party. Maxim number 2, the virtuous attend to their own obligations, but those who are not virtuous speak only of their claims. Maxim number 3, sincere words are not smooth. Smooth words are insincere. These are just a few among the multitude that Laozi wrote. There are strong parallels and similarities with the writings and proverbs in the Old Testament. There is an individuality in the teachings of, as Laozi sought to correct each individual at the very root of his being, to rectify each man's heart and secure purity and simplicity of purpose. Laozi's focus was on inner man, and he assumed that the subjects would not fail to account for themselves with propriety in their relationships with fellow humans, the state, and the world. In other words, he developed the inside of the person in order to enable the person to cope with the outside. Contrary to Laozi, in terms of methodology, remember I said there were 2 sources, Laozi and Confucius. Now they adopted 2 methodologies, separate methodologies. Contrary to Laozi in terms of methodology, Confucius began from the outside and taught propriety of conduct. In other words, he said, if I teach you from the outside, your inside will automatically develop and be in a position to cope with the trials and tribulations. End quote. If people would only observe the rules and forms of good conduct and morals, he believed, sorry, again, some icon. He believed that all human relations would correct themselves and the heart would be reformed by a reform in the habits of life. In other words, teach people good habits and the inside would automatically conform. The ethics of the Far East became a combination and a fusion of the teachings of the two philosophers. Confucius ethics centered on three principles. The first embodies the primary and final law of correct action and implies doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. The second covers the principle of the brotherhood of men put in practice. It includes and requires consideration, charity, forbearance, and thoughtfulness for others, a recognition of the mutuality of rights and interest, and was by the master himself interpreted by the Chinese Golden Law. I'm quoting here from Holko. And what was this golden rule? What you do not wish that others should do unto you, do not unto them. And the third principle in the system was the result of the perfect fruit of obedience to the other two and represents the ideal man, the perfect type of humanity, unquote. The perfect gentleman was one full of dignity, moderation, self-restraint, fortitude, and sincerity. Holcomb concludes by stressing, no higher type may be developed by any code or system of pure ethical training. In other words, he is praising the Asian system of ethics. The striking similarity with the principles enunciated by Ptahhotep is revealing, to say the least. In other words, there is a similarity among the ethical systems or the major ethical systems in the world, irrespective of differences in emphasis. Now, what do we learn then from these ethical systems? The first lesson is that there is one human race. The first observation is that there is no society without a code of ethics, and that while expressions differ, there are great similarities in aspirations towards a good society. All humanity desires a good society. The context within which ethics and morals determine the priorities, for instance, a capitalist economy accentuates an individualistic ethic because of its competitive nature. Western individualism was a product of capitalism, and developing economies are moving in the direction of an individualistic ethic, as well as capitalism increasingly becomes the engine of economic development. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at the older Africa, there was a lot of commonality and a lot of sharing because the mode of production was not competitive as the capitalist mode of production is. I'm not according value or better value between the two. I'm just saying, once you get into a competitive capitalist mode of production, you then accentuate individualism, and the ethics becomes also individualistic. The second lesson, historical experience determines ethical and moral values. It is evident from the similarity in ethical and moral expressions that humankind once shared similarities in experiences. In spite of vast geographical distances, similarities in value in Oriental ethical systems, that is Laos, with those in African systems as Ptahhotep, as well as in the West, that's the Ten Commandments, demonstrate the evidence of this claim, validating Holcomb's assertion that man has been one in all parts of the world. And the third lesson that we learn, humanity desires order and avoids chaos. The raison d'etre for ethics and morality is maintaining social order, with morality as a persuasive mechanism of social control. Ethics and morals are positive incentives for social behavior. This is evidenced in the positive nature of values, with sanctions coming in generally as corrective measures. In general, ethical values are framed in positive language, with negative sanctions coming only when deviance supersedes persuasion. In the absence of morals, the world would indeed be a very difficult place to live in. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Zulu, for your presentation. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask Prof, now's the time. You can either raise your hand and we can open up your mic and you can...
I've taken away.
Hello? And then you can ask your question live. Alternatively, you can type in your question and we can read out your question to him. Okay, I do have a very long comment here. I'm just Dr. Nalia, God is the creator of human beings, and he sent across history his words with the ultimate law and ethics system for the control and benefit of humanity. This defeats all paradigms. The last updated book of God's law revealed was and is the Quran with previous laws. Let me just see if there is a question here because it's very, very long. Just basically at the end, be aware that human rights are not to be considered in this God's rights realm. The solution in this chaotic world, God rules all realms. Thank you for that comment. I have another question from Ashney. So Prof. Ashney asks, how does ethics and morals link to law?
Do I answer now?
Yeah, you can answer now.
How are ethics and morals linked to law? Well, law is generally the codification of the social. In other words, whoever is in charge at a particular time decides, this might be a single person in the case of monarchies and dictatorships, or a parliament. But generally, those in charge decide that certain social values or certain social values have to be promoted, and they decide to codify this. Then once it's codified and legislated for, it becomes law. Similarly, they might decide that certain social vices have to be prevented from occurring at all. They therefore codify this again and legislate for it, and that becomes law. So in short, law is the codification and legalization or legislation of the more social. Ethics being a social concept then become law when they are codified and legislated for. That's the answer.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I'm just, let's see if there's any more. Ashley says thank you. we're just gonna launch a quick poll. If you can just rate the webinar today. So if you can just answer this poll and just give you a few minutes for that. And if anyone else does have any questions that they want to put through, now's the time to type up your question. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand and then you can ask your question live. I do have 2 raised hands, so let me start with that. Prim, I'm going to open up your mic. Sujay, if you could open up Prim's mic. Sorry, we're just having some technical difficulties. There we go, Prim is there. If you can just make sure you're not on mute, Prim, and you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you, Prof, for a wonderful presentation. My question I've sent through as well, how have we shifted away from our ethical and moral compass? Thank you.
That's a very difficult one. How have we shifted away from our ethical and moral compass? Well, ethics generally serves a practical purpose. As I did say, the origins of ethics lie in particular ontologies. And as our ontology being a conception of the nature of being, and as our ontologies change through exposure to a number of things, including science. Remember, let's take the biblical ontology, and God reigned over everything, and we were a creation of God. And as long as God determined what we were and how we were going to go about doing things, we stuck to that, and the ethical system also was predicated on that. And as our ontologies shift through our exposure to various forces, science, technology, and the other things, we start doubting the original ontologies, and those influences, ontological influences, diminish, and therefore would eventually abandon the original ethical codes and pursue new ones which are a product of our new exposure. This is literally a broad answer to that. Changes in ontological persuasions cause changes in the way we regard our relationships with one another and with other institutions, etc.
Okay, thank you, Prof. And thank you for that question. We do have another raised hand by Andrew. So if, Sujay, you can open that mic for us. Okay, Andrew, you are there. If you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Prof, for a very interesting presentation. My question is, where or how does the African principle of Ubuntu articulate with African ethics?
You are very faint. I can hardly hear you. Can you raise your voice, please?
Can you hear me now?
A bit, yes. Slightly improved.
My question is about Ubuntu. How does Ubuntu articulate with African ethics?
Again, I don't get you. How do we articulate?
Ubuntu with African ethics.
Yes, thank you.
Repeat the question, please.
So how do you articulate Ubuntu with African ethics, Prof?
Or
How do you
does one
articulate
Ubuntu
with African ethics?
Aha. I think Ubuntu can be articulated into African humanism. In other words, the human being is the center of focus. At some stage, I said that the African ethical system is humanistic and utilitarian. In other words, humanity is at the center of focus. And this humanity is referred to as Ubuntu, being human. Whereas the Western ethical system can have abstractions such as justice, equality, etc., as values. And therefore, the ethics is built around arriving at equality, arriving at justice. Whereas in the African system, the humanistic approach says the wellness of human beings is paramount. What does that mean? I said a consequentialist approach in ethics says it is not the things in themselves that matter. It is not the deeds in themselves that matter, but it is the consequence of the deeds that is very important. Therefore, if an act or a deed promotes the wellness of humanity, then that is ethically correct. That's how you articulate Ubuntu into African ethics. The focus is humanity, the human being. It is not an abstraction like the focus is justice. The human being has to be in a state of well-being or wellness. That's how one articulates Ubuntu into African humanity.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. We do have two more questions that have come through. One from Prim. Thank you. So how do we maintain our ontological being whilst being influenced by push and pull drives or forces?
Gosh, that's another difficult one. How do we maintain our ontological being while we're being pushed by? It's really the extent to which we are resilient. It's put it this way, we appeal to the human reason. I did say that part of all ethical systems, literally, though that might not be accentuated in others, the reason plays a very important part because the individual is endowed with the power of reason and logic. If we think that the forces, the pushes and pulls that impinge upon us also affect our ontology, we have to adjust accordingly. Either stick to the ontology because we believe it's a very rational thing to do, or we change the ontology because we think the new ontology coming into being as a result of the pushes and pulls will take us to a better state of humanity. So it becomes an individual's choice whether to accept the changes in ontology as leading to the better, or the changes in ontology as getting us to a worse position. Have I answered you?
She's not live, but I think if she will respond. But we've got. She says yes, thanks. Okay.
Good.
We have two more questions, and then we're going to just finish off with these last two. One from Ella, one from Dr. Nalia. So Ella says, we see ethics and morality in relation to human behavior with each other, but what about human relationship with nature, animals, and the universe or the environment?
Yeah, that also becomes a function of our ontology. The way we locate nature and environment in the cosmos will determine the way we relate to those things. In a sense, humanity has lived a predatory life. What do I mean? We have found nature and the environment as sources of our livelihood. We cut down the trees to get fuel out of them, building material, etc. That's anthropocentric. We are centering the universe around humanity or human beings. And the trees themselves do not carry any value until exposure. They do not carry any value other than fulfilling the human need until exposure to some new forms of learning, like environmental protection, because if we cut down all the trees, we'll promote global warming, deprive the world of oxygen, etc., etc. The relationship between nature and the environment has always been, between nature, environment, and humanity, has always been predatory in favor of the humans, and until humans learn better. So in other words, our ontology is also influenced by our own fortunes, put it this way. The original ontology changes with the changes in our fortunes. Have I made myself clear? I've gone into the realm of the philosophical and lost everybody.
I'll see if it responds. But in the meantime, I'll read that last question by Dr. Nalia. She says, to draw on my previous comments and on Prof's previous reply, how do we retrieve the original ethical codes and implement them in this chaotic world? Isn't it in the interest of humanity that there should be a consensus among belief systems, not philosophies and man-made thoughts? A universal code should be drafted. This universal code of ethics would draw on and be synthesized from all scriptures, God's words across belief systems, and this would be God's laws implemented in the world. So what do you have any comments or about that, Prof?
Yeah, there are lots of similarities in the ethical systems. As I did say at the beginning, the framing is cultural and environmental, but the spirit is the same. Now the question then becomes, is it practical to enforce a universal ethical code? I think the lessons lie in the United Nations. If it were, remember, the United Nations is not a world government. I'm citing the United Nations because it's the only existing force that almost brings the existing power that almost brings all the nations of the world together. Once we invented something called a government and invented something called a national government as an embodiment of the national spirit, whether it works or doesn't work is another story. And these national governments then decided to form something almost akin to a world government without it being a world government, and that is the United Nations. It's the only organization that we know of, but I do not think it has sufficient clout and power to be able to enforce a world government. Religion is a personal nature or a personal concept. It becomes a collective concept because most of us follow the same thing. That's how churches and religious systems operate. And there's not even one serious agreement which binds all religious systems. Take the church, the Christian church. It's split into a number of denominations, and there's a multitude of them. You then add the other faiths and add the non-faiths. It's a nightmare for the realization of a universal ethical code. That's what I would say. It's possible to the extent that governments of the world agree upon it. I do not know the extent to which A, that is possible, and B, enforceable.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Prof. Prim just says, yes, we should be custodians rather than predators of natural resources. I think that was in response to your other question from Ella. So thank you for today, Prof. If you do see on your screen now, we do have contact details for two of our ladies, Sandiswa and Venosha. If you enjoyed this session and you want to learn more about this topic, or perhaps you want to host a similar session for your own organization, you can contact either Cindy or Venosha, and their details are on the screen. If you have any further questions for Prof, you're welcome to send them through this afternoon when we do send out our mailer with access to the video. You can send more questions out there. Just if you have a look at the slide now, this is our upcoming webinar for next month, Compliance or Better Practice, Health and Safety in Uncertain Times. So if you would like to attend this webinar, please do RSVP on our website, www.ukzn.extendedlearning.com. So thank you so much, Prof, for presenting today, and we can hopefully work on some future webinars for you to cover this topic in more detail. Thank you as well to all our attendees for joining us. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed the session and stay safe. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.